Next month, we will see the release of a sequel to the cult classic, the cult hit Hellblade, which came out a number of years ago. This newer entry will be a Xbox and PC exclusive, and it will only be available digitally. There will be no physical edition for Hellblade 2, similar to Alan Wake 2, which came out last year. And as a result of the game being digital only, it will only cost $50 at launch. So a developer of Hellblade 2 has made an interesting statement recently, over the last few weeks, and that statement was from Ninja Theory studio head Dom Matthews, who stated that Hellblade 2 is the right shape and size of experience. He went on to say that, "I think what we always set out to do is to tell a story and for the game length to be appropriate for the story that we want to tell." So basically what he's saying is that this game is clearly going to be very similar to the first one. It's a narrative-driven game, first and foremost, with some combat sprinkled in. And it's going to be around the same length as the first Hellblade, which is 8 hours. And this brings up a more important question of game length in general. This guy went on to clarify his stance. He says that Ninja Theory has found an audience for shorter games where every step of that journey is meaningful. He said that he's really pleased that there's a lot of people that actually enjoy a shorter experience, and that these people don't necessarily want something that is, 50 plus hours long, and that he's one of the people that like shorter games. He said that there's an audience for people that want games that are more focused. And then IGN uploaded a poll to this article asking what is the ideal game length. And the winner to that poll is at 36%, you could round that up to 37%, said that anywhere from 15 to 30 hours is the sweet spot. This is out of 3,000 voters. That's a small pool of people. So when it comes to game length, video games should be kept at a certain length, but it should be dependent on, in my opinion, the genre of said game. Different genres work at different levels of length. So just me pointing out some examples. If you're making an action adventure game, anywhere from 10 to 15 hours should be the sweet spot for that particular genre of game. You could probably go slightly shorter, you could probably go slightly longer, but not exponentially so. Generally, if you're going to go shorter, it should be within the span of 2 hours. If you're going to go longer, it should also be within the span of 2 hours. That's for an action adventure game. If you're making a first-person shooter, that's not an RPG, it's just traditional first-person shooter. It's not an open world game. It's a structured type of experience. Anywhere from 8 to 12 hours long is your sweet spot for that particular genre. If you're making a survival horror game, anywhere from 8 to 12 hours is your sweet spot. If it's longer than 12 hours, your gameplay loop is going to suffer, and the game is going to become tedious, and the more tedious a game becomes, the less fun it becomes, the more annoying and frustrating the experience gets. If you're making an RPG, I'd say the sweet spot for an RPG would be anywhere from 20 to 30 hours. If it's longer than that, it generally typically means that there's a lot of padding. And I'm not talking about the cutscenes. Cutscenes generally they add anywhere from 10 hours on up to any game. But just counting the gameplay itself, for an RPG, anything that's between the range of 20 to 30 hours, that's your sweet spot. If it's longer than that, it likely means it's padded. There are certain games, there are certain exceptions to these rules, obviously. For RPG games, something like Persona 5, which is heavily narrative focused. The story and the characters were so good in that game that, it was able to skirt the rule of, keeping the game within a certain length. But then you have, a game like the Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy and The Witcher 3, both of which are padded to hell. The Witcher 3, I think everyone gave that game a pass mainly due to the way the side missions were designed. Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I'm sure Rebirth is much worse, the side quests are nowhere near good enough to justify those games being 40 plus hours long. And as I'm mentioning these times right here, I'm talking about just the general length of the game, the general length of the main story. I'm not talking about completionist time. Completionist time is very different than standard time. I'm talking standard time only. If you're making a fighting game and you're making, a story campaign for a fighting game, 5 hours max is your sweet spot. You don't want to go shorter than 3 hours, but you don't want to go longer than 5 hours. Because in a way, the campaign is, in the fighting game, it's really meant to be like a long tutorial from a gameplay perspective. It gives you the opportunity to play around with some of the characters on the roster, so you can decide who you actually want to main, who you want to actually use and control. And considering the story mode in the fighting game is really meant to be seen as optional anyway, it's necessary, but it's optional, as in the player doesn't really have to engage with it if they don't want to. There's no reason to make something like that super long. So again, 3 to 5 hours for a story mode in a fighting game, that's, again, that's your sweet spot. So most video games that come out, they tend to stick to these rules. Most survival horror games, for example, are anywhere between 8 to 12 hours long. Some of them are longer, like Alien Isolation, that's 20 hours. It's almost a 20-hour game, which is a big part of the reason why it flopped. But I digress. Alan Wake 2, another survival horror game, is 20 hours long. I think that game is over 20 hours long. But it was able to get away with that because of its storytelling. The story was good in that game. So that game was able to get away with having an extended runtime. But it is not the norm for that particular genre. First-person shooter games, if you look at, a number of the Halo games, most of those games are anywhere between 7 to 8 hours long. The longest Call of Duty game, which is Black Ops 3, is around 9 hours. Most of them fall between the 6 to 8 hour range for that particular franchise. Most of them are minimum 7 hours. So these are just some examples as to, what you want to keep your game at when it comes to length. Length in a video game is severely important. If you're developing a first-person shooter and you make your game 20 plus hours long and it's not an RPG, you're going to see low player retention. People are going to drop the game very quickly. People are going to get burnt out and they're not going to want to come back to your game. And if your game has a story in it, people are going to lose interest very quickly. This is one of the problems with open world games. This is one of the reasons why open world games are so difficult to develop, because a lot of them are narrative driven games and it's hard to maintain focus on a story if the player is able to freely go and do other random activities and not even focus on the main story. There are open world games that are really good at doing that, like the Horizon games, for example. Perfect examples. And that's mainly because a number of the side missions in those games are actually well written and they don't feel pointless. But then you have other open world games that don't have as many interesting side quests, like the Spider-Man games, for example, but those games get away with it because the gameplay is so good that you can ignore some of the weaker side quests. And then you have games that are just terrible at it, just outright, like Dragon's Dogma 2, for example, where they make the fast traveling system tedious and annoying, and the main story just becomes an afterthought. Everyone has a different opinion on, what length video games should be, but my opinion lines up more with the facts. based on, having played multiple games and multiple genres and, just taking notes of different trends that I've noticed over the years. So for me, there is no general runtime for how long a video game should be. It all depends on what the genre is and exactly what the developers are trying to actually do with the project. Although I will say this, no video game should be 100 plus hours long. Video games that are typically that long are that long because they do have an overabundance of content. Either that or the gameplay loop is so addicting and it's so fun that you can easily cross over the 100-hour mark. Fighting games are a good example. You can easily rack up 100 hours in a fighting game because there's different characters that you can play as, and there's different play styles that you can master, and you can easily rack up 100 hours, 100 plus hours in a fighting game. As long as the content is there and the drive to actually improve and get better is there, racking up 100 hours in a fighting game is not something that is hard to do. Whereas other genres, unless you play multiplayer, like for a first person shooter, there's no reason why you should go anywhere near 100 hours in a typical, traditional first person shooter. That's not an RPG. Personally, as someone who's now older, I prefer games that are anywhere between 15 to 20 hours simply because I can get through them faster. And that's on the long end. On the short end, anywhere between 8 to 10 hours, maybe a little more, and I'm good. I've had my fill. The days of playing, 40-hour, 50-hour, 60-hour, 70-hour games, I don't have much interest in doing that anymore. Games like that are a huge time sink, and most of the time they're not worth the trouble. That's just my opinion. So I thought this was an interesting opinion from, an industry developer, and I do think that we need shorter games in the industry. There's too many RPGs that are being released. There's too many open world games that are being released, and there's not enough, traditional shorter experiences, especially in the AAA space.